study of the life of Abraham. We are going to begin Genesis 20 this morning. In fact, we might even finish Genesis 20. It's not an overly complicated chapter, and it might feel a little bit oddly familiar to some of you who have been paying attention in this class. So we're leaving behind Lot. We're not going to be seeing Lot anymore from here on out. Let's go ahead and just start reading. Someone read for us Genesis chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, please.
And Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech king of Gerar sent and took Sarah.
Okay. So, this is just kind of the opening here. We're told here that Abraham is moving. Now, where has he been for the last several chapters? Anyone remember? Where has he been located? He's been in the area of Hebron, the great trees of Mamre, that region. So he's leaving that region. We're not told exactly why he's decided to move. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah has happened, but that doesn't seem to have really any impact on his decision to move. At least if there is, we're not told. So he heads south to the Negev. This is an area of wilderness on the border, the southern border of what would be the future nation of Israel. And for a time he stays in the area of Gerar. Now, the exact location of this is not clear. Some people say, well, this should be a translation of a different word or a different name, or, it's a city that was abandoned at some point. There's not a lot of agreement on it. You're not going to find, or maybe if you dig deeper, then maybe you'll find some stuff on it. But it seems to be the implication here that this is a southern Philistine city. Now, you will notice that the word Philistine was not anywhere in these verses that were just read. It's going to kind of become obvious that this is what that is and all that. So I'm just kind of getting ahead there. Anyway, so he stays in the area of Gerar. And while there, Abraham pulls a classic move, calling Sarah, his wife, his sister. Now, because of this, the king, Abimelech, king of Gerar, he sends for her, takes her, is going to make her his own. Now, have we seen this ever before? This is not the first time this has happened, which I have so much more to comment on now this time. If you go back to Genesis chapter 12, way early in the study, in kind of the second half of that chapter, Abram does this exact same thing when they go down to Egypt. Remember, there's a famine, so they go down to Egypt because Egypt has food, and he's afraid the Egyptians are going to kill him and take Sarai, his wife, because she's so beautiful. They just won't be able to help themselves, and he's just in fear of his life. And so he pulls the same thing where he says, well, this is my sister. Now, in Genesis chapter 12, she would have been at least, I'm trying to think what the math would have been on that. Well, she would have been at least 65, something like that. 65 years old, at least. Probably a couple of years older than that, but she's at least that age. Now, at this point in Genesis chapter 20, she's 89. And he still has this same issue where you're so beautiful, someone is going to kill me and take you. But at the same time, the king of Gerar is apparently interested in her because of her beauty. So I guess Abraham can't necessarily be wrong about that attribute of her. At 89, I'm a little skeptical, but I know, I'm thinking 89. There's no way any of us will look that good at that age. So I don't know, but.
I would say
Yeah, 89. At that point, anyway, but it is a thing that comes up again. We'll be referencing Genesis chapter 12 several times in this part of chapter 20, kind of looking back and seeing what things are similar, what things are different. Now, I wanted to take. I don't know if I'm skipping ahead of myself. No, I'll talk about it now. I want to talk about Abimelech himself. We're going to see more of him throughout this chapter, and then also in chapter 21. But this name Abimelech actually comes up several times in the Bible, so I want to kind of make distinctions on who we're talking about. because we see this kind of almost used as a title or as a designation, I think, as well. Maybe similar to Pharaoh in some ways, but it's not quite used as commonly. Now, there is a King Abimelech of Gerar in Genesis chapter 26, and in that, we're not going to read it for the sake of time, but if you go and you turn to Genesis chapter 26, you're going to find the literal exact same thing is going to happen, but instead of Abraham and Sarah, it's Isaac and Rebekah, where he says, this is my sister, because he's so worried that they're going to kill him because she's so beautiful. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sees her, is like, oh, I want to take her as my own. And basically the same thing happens again, but instead it's with Isaac and Rebekah. Now that Abimelech does not seem to be the same one as the one here in chapter 20, because, well, first off, we don't see that Abimelech saying, oh, I've been foiled again a second time for the same reason. But just there's been this time that's passed. So it's probably a son, maybe a grandson, but probably a son of this Abimelech in chapter 20. Of course, there's also the person named Abimelech in Judges. He's a big topic in Judges chapter 9, the son of Gideon. Tries to make himself king, but he's not a Philistine. He's an Israelite, of course. And the last one I want to talk about, in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 10 through 15, this is when Saul is pursuing David, trying to kill him. And at this point, David actually hides out in Gath for a while, the Philistine city of Gath. And he does this thing where he pretends to be a madman. He pretends to be insane or out of his mind, depending on your translation, so that the king of Gath doesn't kill him, because he kind of fears being killed by the king there. And the name used there, I believe in most translations, is Achish, king of Gath. And Achish sees him and says, get him out of here. He's just some crazy person. This can't be the David they're talking about. Now, remember that, but if you turn to Psalm 34, verse 1, it says that it's a psalm of David when he was pretending to be insane in the presence of Abimelech. Now, that's not the same name, but it's certainly referring to the same instance. At least I believe it is. So again, it may be a designation or a title that was used amongst the Philistines for those in high positions like kings. It's not exactly clear because it's not used as consistently as Pharaoh, because anytime you see the king of Egypt, it's always Pharaoh. We don't always see that with the Philistines, but there's a pretty good possibility that that's the case. So there are multiple Abimelechs. So if you're looking up, the name Abimelech, and you see it come up again and again, it's not always the same guy. Just kind of keep that in mind. Make sure you're reading it in context. So I wanted to kind of talk about that. And if we ever did a study of Isaac, don't be surprised about what happens in Genesis 26, I guess. But we won't get there in this study. That's a little bit outside our scope. But it is funny that the exact same thing happens with Isaac and Rebekah in chapter 26 as it does with Abraham and Sarah in chapter 20. So I don't have an explanation for that exactly, but there it is. Any comments on these first two verses? I've kind of talked a lot here. I just wanted to lay out some groundwork.
I don't know if now would be the time to talk about the subject of honesty or truthfulness in speaking.
We'll probably touch on that a little bit later. Yeah, because Abimelech is going to kind of go to Abraham and be very straightforward about why did you say this. So we'll get to that. Let's keep reading. Someone read verses 3 through 7, please. 3 through 7.
God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." And Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, "Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? Even she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands I have done this." And God said to him in a dream, "Yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart, for I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours."
Okay, so I don't actually have that much to say about this section. It seems pretty clear cut here. God comes to Abimelech in a dream and basically informs him, "Hey, this is a man's wife you've taken here, and you're basically a dead man, everything's going to be really bad for you. And Abimelech kind of comes out and says, I had no idea. They both said, he said, she's my sister. And then Sarah said, he's my brother. I did this with a clear conscience. I haven't done anything wrong. And God agrees, like, obviously you've done this and you didn't know. This was ignorance. And God says, this is why I did not let you touch her. Basically, God is, in a way, protecting Abimelech from committing this sin without knowing. And but God's hand is apparently against Abimelech here. He's saying, if you're not going to make this right, you're all going to be basically wiped out. It seems a pretty harsh language from God. God is not messing around here. One other thing I think is interesting is God refers to, and I believe he's referring to Abraham here, as a prophet. Now, I don't know if we've ever seen that word used for Abraham up until this point, but God gives him that designation, so I'm not going to argue with God about that. So it's very interesting that Abraham is considered by God to be someone who speaks the truth, who teaches the ways of God, and he says he's going to make it right if you give him back his wife. So very interesting thing. Again, I don't really have much more to say about this section. Any other comments? Go ahead, Jeff.
Things, the idea of a prophet, you remember in the patriarchal age, God spoke to the patriarchs of the families, of the clans, and they were responsible for relaying what they received from God to their children. In that sense, they would be a prophet speaking the things of God to their children. So that would be a sense in which he is a prophet. Also, some of us may have a problem with the wording of God's statement to Abimelech. It seems pretty rough, and we wonder, is this really who God is? What we don't know is who Abimelech was. Maybe God's dealing with Abimelech the way he needs to deal with Abimelech, because this is how Abimelech learns and listens. Maybe he won't listen if God is more gentle. We come from generally a very peaceful background. We need to recognize that in ancient times, and Abraham testifies, this is the reason he lied about, that's the reason he deceived Pharaoh and Abimelech, was because this was a ruthless time. You just did not, as a stranger, walk about through countries and into the next peoples and in the next people. You just didn't do that. If you did, you would be accused of being a spy, or you're trying to steal something. Why couldn't you not make a living in your own among your own people? You must be a cast out. You must be a troublemaker. You must be someone who's of the devil. So there's lots of reasons for it to be dangerous for them, for Abraham to travel around. That's why Hebrews talks about, by faith, Abraham left Ur of Chaldees. Why? Because God told him to. And by faith he did this, knowing that this was dangerous. So I suspect that if we knew more about Abimelech, we'd know exactly why God comes to him and speaks to him this way in the dream. He doesn't want to have to talk about this 4 or 5 times. He wants one time to talk to Abimelech, get the matter resolved. This is not part of the plan. And so I think, again, a lot of times we don't know Uzzah, we don't know these other people, and so we come to conclusions about God because of the way he deals with certain situations. All of the Bible tells us of the love, the mercy, the kindness, the compassion, the gentleness, the patience of God. So what we don't know are these other characters.
Yeah, and I would say, I would agree that God's words to Abimelech are extremely harsh, but I think his actions are extremely merciful. God has kept him from, really committing this sin to the full degree, and he's given him a warning and given him an opportunity to make it right. There's nothing in this that he can't come back from, if you will. God has made the situation such that he's not going to let Abimelech commit this sin in ignorance without knowing what is going on. And we can look at it and say it's really not Abimelech's fault here. Abraham is, well, we'll talk about Abraham in a bit.
One other thing, you touched on this, this would have been a sin of ignorance, and this implies the fact that ignorance is not an excuse for us to sin.
Yeah, and I would agree with that.
So when we have done something by accident in ignorance, then we need to have a humble attitude, we need to apologize, we need to make things right as best we
Yeah, there's still a consequence of some kind. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's it's well, I'm going to save that. I'm going to get ahead of myself here. Go ahead, Arnold.
I just want to say that it's really striking how God was telling the Israelites, y'all don't want a king. The king do what he wants. You see right here, he wanted her, he took her, and there was literally nothing that could be done about it. So you think the Jews would have learned what God said, no, you don't want a king. No, we want a king.
Yeah, they take the opposite route. They look at the examples around them. They say, we do want that. And of course, Samuel warns them. He says, you're going to have this person, and they're going to take your sons and lead them into war. They're going to take your daughters and have them as wives and concubines, and they're going to put you to work, and they're going to tax you. Like all these terrible things that'd be like, yeah, maybe we don't want that. But no, they say, no, we want a king. We want to be like the other nations around us. And of course, God tells Samuel, like, don't see this as a rejection of you. This is a rejection of me. They can't just have me as their king. That's not good enough for them. That's kind of a whole nother subject there too. I'm not going to try to get into too much political philosophy about that. I could go a lot farther, but let's go ahead and keep reading here. Someone read for us verses 8 through, let's see how one it is, 8 through 13, I guess.
So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their hearing. And the men were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to have been done. Then Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you have in view that you have done this thing? Is that where I stand?
Go all the way through 13.
13. And Abraham said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed, she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, this is your kindness, that you should do for me. In every place, wherever we go, say to me, he is my brother.
Okay. There's a bit to unpack here. First off, let's look at Abimelech here at the start of these verses, verse 8. It says, early the next morning, and then he calls his officials together. He tells them what's happened. So he's not waiting around. This isn't this can wait after breakfast, after first morning reports, because he's a king. He's probably got some work to do. He's probably got busy things going on. But this is the first thing he takes care of. So he's taking God's warning seriously. So to his credit, he is trying to make this right, and he's going to do it as quickly as he can. He calls his officials together. They're all in fear. They're afraid of what's about to happen.
Is that what you call this a God-fearing house?
Interesting, huh? Yeah. Which seems to be in contrast of what Abraham seems to think about it. So let's talk about this interaction. So Abimelech calls in Abraham, and he kind of straight up tells Abraham, why have you deceived me? Why have you caused me to have this guilt, to lead us into this sinful act, to do things that ought not to be done? Some of your translations will say. He wants to know why Abraham thinks that this is an okay thing to do. Now, like last time in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham explained that he believed he was in a non-God-fearing land or country, and he was afraid that he'd be killed, so they'd take his wife. But that seems to be that both Pharaoh back in chapter 12 and Abimelech here in chapter 20 have sort of the same reaction, as they have some fear of God. Now, we're not going to say that these were exactly the righteous people. We don't have any indication of that. Idol worship is already existing by this point. We just don't see a ton of it yet. That could be a whole other study in itself. But when God comes to them and says, hey, you've done something wrong, they react to it. They're not ignoring it. They're not saying, well, what God are you? I don't know you. So even though they seem to be somewhat more removed from service to God, more so than Abraham, who's considered extremely faithful in his time, it's not like they're totally ignorant or totally ignoring God. And we don't know exactly how to gauge that. Do remember that back in chapter 14, we had Melchizedek, who was considered a righteous king, or priest king, if you will. And he was a king of Salem, but he was also their priest to the Lord God Almighty, the exact same God that Abraham recognized. And Melchizedek is, by all means, he's probably a Canaanite, he's probably a Jebusite, if I was going to be specific. He's not a descendant of Abraham. He's not of any certain genealogy that would make him righteous. In fact, the Hebrews writer makes that very clear. That's kind of the point. So I struggle a little bit myself, and I don't know where the rest of you land on this, why Abraham has such a fear of, well, nobody knows God except me. Now, maybe they don't have that close relationship to God like Abraham does, but God is not unknown in these parts. What they do know about God, we're not exactly told. It's not super clear, but they do recognize that, hey, there's this Lord God Almighty, and he's with Abraham, and I better be careful about that. So anyway, there's that. So what Abraham says that they do, he says, this is what they do every place they go. And we know this happened in Genesis chapter 12. Basically, when they're wandering around, he says, this is my sister, and Sarah says, this is my brother. And I think it's funny in verse 13, some of your translations will translate this as Abraham saying, this is how you can show your kindness to me. Say that I am your brother, or you're my sister. But in the NIV, it says, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Now, that seems like a really weird way for Sarah to show her affection for her husband, but she is being submissive. She is following his lead. I suppose there is that. If there's any fault here, it's kind of Abraham at this point. He says he's afraid, and this is his plan. But they are actually, he explains here in these verses that they actually are brother and sister on a technicality. They're half siblings. He says that they have the same father, but not the same mother, which means Terah was not just Abraham's father, but also he would have been the father of Sarah as well. Now, we don't know who their mothers were exactly. We're not given those details, but they would have had the same father. I'm assuming what Abraham is saying here is true. I don't have any reason to doubt that. We don't see this contradicted anywhere else. This would be kind of a technicality to get out of saying, well, I didn't actually lie because she actually is my sister, but this is still very deceptive. And I don't think anyone is saying like, oh yeah, you're vindicated. You're totally, no one ever says that. This seems to still not be maybe the greatest plan here. So yeah, and again, as I mentioned before, this plan is used again by Isaac and Rebekah in Genesis chapter 26, and they are notably not brother and sister at all. I mean, they would be cousins, I think, would be the relationship, something like that. But they're certainly not brother and sister. So,
The way we use the word.
no, it wouldn't be, yeah.
And actually, the Hebrew word, I don't know what the Hebrew word is, but it may well be that it's not as much of a stretch in the Hebrew as it is in the English.
It could be. I'm not linguistically inclined enough to know for sure. But it's just, they did this in Genesis chapter 12. You think they would have said, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. Maybe we should have come up with a different idea. Maybe Abraham would just trust in God a little bit more. Because remember, God has told Abraham over and over again, here's the plan, here's what's going to happen. And he's been with him this entire time. And yet Abraham is still afraid, oh, maybe they're going to kill me for my wife. Like, obviously that's not going to work if God is with you. Go ahead, Arnold. You had your hand up.
I'm just gonna say, God tells them to go all these places. So God certainly knows what's going on around these different places. But the fact that she is his wife, you can try to twist it between the brother and sister, my dad, mama, but she is his wife. And
Yeah, I think maybe one of the distinctions between like Pharaoh and Abimelech and the people of the cities of the plain that we read about in chapter 19 is they probably didn't care for that bond so much. And that may be the difference of why they were destroyed, and these other places that Abraham didn't seem to think were very God-fearing, but apparently they had some God-fears. They recognized this relationship of the husband and wife, and they did respect that. Now, maybe you could say they respected it under the threat of what God was going to do to them, but they respected that, so...
It's ironic that the word Philistine has come to mean worldly heathen. And here in this household, you have a household full of seems to be God-fearing people.
Yeah, I'm going to get on a tangent just a second. The Philistines, I think when we talk about the Philistines, a lot of times we think of the Philistines in the Saul and David era, and their wickedness. I mean, we see their idolatry, we see how they're at constant warfare with the Israelites. I get all that. I understand that's probably what we usually think of when we talk about the Philistines. Now, the Philistines as a nation seems to have a very big change between Genesis, when we see their interactions with Abraham and Isaac, into when, after the Exodus, when the children of Israel coming back out of Egypt into the Promised Land. Because we're not going to go to it for the sake of time, but I'll just sum up real quick. In Genesis chapter 26, or maybe it's the chapter after that, maybe it's chapter 27. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's going to be one of those two. Isaac is actually told by the Philistines to leave because he's too great and too powerful, and they kind of fear him, so they don't want him around anymore. They say, go somewhere else. But then when you have the Exodus, God doesn't take them through the Philistine country because he thinks, well, they're going to look at them and think that they're so powerful and mighty, and they're going to lose heart, and they're not going to want to actually go into the Promised Land through this direction. So, and then you see when they do get into the Promised Land, even after they get settled in, the Philistines are there, and the Philistines have ironworks, which seems to be unique to them. The Israelites don't know how to work with iron, which gives the Philistines a huge technological advantage. If you don't know the difference between being able to have iron weapons and bronze weapons, it's a big deal. Like in antiquity, that's like the biggest deal you can have. It's like having the internet and having the telegraph, if you will. It's kind of that big jump. And there's just a whole bunch of things that change between Genesis and Exodus for the Philistines. And we don't have, the Bible doesn't record it, but we have some interesting notes. If you guys remember our Genesis 10 study, we have two different people in Genesis chapter 10 that are claimed to be ancestors of the Philistines, which seems to indicate that there was a change in the demographic at some point. There's a lot more to get into that. But the Philistines are very interesting people that seem to have a very big evolution, if you will, during that time. Now, so here they seem to fear God, at least to a degree that they're going to give Sarah back to Abraham, and they do have respect for his descendants. They fear Isaac, but then post the Exodus, the Philistines are not that way at all. They're willing to do whatever it takes to get rid of the Israelites. They're in constant warfare. Goliath himself was shouting insults about God and his people, and you just have this constant issues. So there seems to be a very, I think I'd call it a downward spiral spiritually, even though technologically they are on the up and up. Okay, I'm going to get off that tangent now. Any other things through verse 13 there? Go ahead.
You were talking about Abraham assuming that the fear of God was not in this place. The Bible tells us that love thinks no evil. And we need to be people who look for godliness in other people. Now, they may not look like us, they may not dress like us, or they have some other characteristics that may be worldly looking, but don't assume that somebody doesn't want the gospel. Assume that they are God-fearing
He's going to be enriched again, yeah.
So, it just, we can't judge Pharaoh, we can't judge Abraham by our laws today, by our understanding of God today. What bothers me more about this is not the fact that he deceived Pharaoh and Abimelech. What does bother me a little bit is the fact that Abraham didn't trust God more.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I always wonder about is,
He is the father of the faithful. Now,
and God has told him multiple times, this is going to come to pass, and he's believed God, and yet he's still not at the point where he's willing to just say, this is my wife, and not fear someone is going to come out of the bushes and kill him.
trust that God
yeah.
will take care of it.
Yeah,
You know, he trusted that even if he killed his son Isaac, that God perhaps would raise him from the dead. In the same way, there was something that was different about Sarah, and I'm not sure exactly what that is. Abraham was human, and God knows that. God recognizes that. God is compassionate for the difficulties we go through. Now, we still have to repent, and I would assume that Abraham had to repent of this. We're not told, but
yeah.
God is not a respecter of persons, and to whatever degree Abraham should not have done this, I'm sure God and he worked that out later, and we're not told about that. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But it doesn't disappoint me that he deceived him. It does disappoint me a little bit that he seemed to have a lapse in faith. And it's a lesson for us. We have to trust in God even in times of danger, even in times of worry. And we live in a difficult time. We've got to trust God. We've got to, we can't take precautions to protect our earthly body or our earthly possessions and things like that. We have to trust in God and always try to do the right thing.
And also learn from our mistakes when we make them. Chapter 12, okay, fine. Like, that was a bad choice, but he's done it again. And it's interesting what he says in verse 13, or, kind of all over the place. He says, this is everywhere we go, this is what we do. So it's not just here and, chapter 12. It seems to imply this is wherever they go, this is what they're saying to people.
It seemed to have gotten him out of trouble.
I don't know. Because, we have all these times where we just have these huge spans of years where nothing is recorded for us. So we don't know. One interesting thing, though, to kind of hit back at Abraham a little bit is he was at least on good enough terms with the Amorites in chapter 14 that he was able to make alliances with some of them. And it seems to be implied that they also went with his men to help rescue Lot in chapter 14 against the four-king coalition. So I'm not exactly sure where Abraham is trying to draw this line or why he's trying to draw this line. But as you said, we need to have faith in God. And God has been very clear with Abraham of what he's going to do for him. And Abraham hasn't always understood, and Abraham doesn't understand God's timetable. Certainly, I understand that. Having your promised son age 100 seems to be, well, that's insane. No one's ever heard of this. In that era, post or pre-flood era, certainly that happened all the time. We see that's recorded for us. But in the time after the flood, as you get farther and farther down the generations, the people are not living as long. Now, Abraham will still live a very, very long life compared to us, but even in his time, that is much shorter than what you would have seen with, Methuselah and guys like that who are living 900 years or so, and he's going to live not quite 200. So it's a very big difference there. So it is a different era. It's a different situation, but I still think that Abraham probably could have had more faith in God, and I think that is one of the lessons we need to learn from that. Very good. Any other comments through verse 13?
Oh, one other thing.
Okay.
Just another occasion where we can appreciate how God wrote the Bible. These characters that God chooses are not perfect men. And they're an example for us because we know we are not perfect. And so God tells us things that I believe most men, if they were making this story up, would have left out. But he tells us these things and lets us know that
and they're called faithful men. You know, in Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham is among all of those, and many of them had their issues. I mean, we can't say that they were perfect. They're not infallible as far as that goes, which goes in the face of, you know, some beliefs of some certain people in some certain positions. We are not infallible. Let's finish this off. We're almost out of time. Someone read Genesis 14 through the end of the chapter, through verse 18, please.
And Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male slaves, and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, My land is before you, live wherever you like. To Sarah he said, I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls, so they could have children again. For the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife Sarah.
Okay, so after this encounter, this interaction that Abraham and Abimelech have, Abimelech gifts Abraham a bunch of stuff. We have sheep, cattle, slaves. He gives them to Abraham, gives him his wife back, and he also gives him 1,000 shekels of silver. Basically, you know, he's saying, you know, I am guiltless of this. You're vindicated. Here's some stuff. You know, everything's good between us. Any wrong I may have done, this is going to cover that. Even though he doesn't seem to have had any relations with Sarah to this point. That's the implication here. But he's saying even any show of possibility of that, I'm going to cover it. Which, if you remember back in Genesis chapter 12, this is what Pharaoh also did. He gives Abraham all this stuff on the account of his wife. This is back in chapter 12, we think is where Hagar probably came from. We don't know for sure. But basically the same thing happens here. There is one notable difference here between this and chapter 12. If you remember in Genesis chapter 12, when Pharaoh found out about what had happened, he sends him off with all this stuff. He says, go, take your things, be off, be on your way. But Abimelech does the opposite. He says, our land is here, hang out here, choose where you want to be around here. You're welcome to be here. So there seems to be, at least at this time, not any hard feelings about this, even though Abimelech could have said the same thing as Pharaoh did back in chapter 12, and we would have understood that completely. But he doesn't have any issues. He thinks everything's fine now. And he says, go ahead and hang out here for a while if you want. And Abraham is going to seem to do that. Now, going later on in time to Genesis chapter 26 again, that is not going to be the case later. When Isaac and Rebekah pull the same stunt, there's eventually there's some rough times between Isaac and that Abimelech of that time. So things do change over time again. Now, one of the things that it closes out at the end of this chapter, we have Abraham praying to God on behalf of Abimelech, and then his wife, his female slaves, they're healed. They're able to conceive again because this matter with Sarah has been resolved. Now, this seems to be like we remember back in Genesis chapter 12. It talks about the household was inflicted with serious diseases. It doesn't tell us exactly what that was. We don't know if that was leprosy or what. We're just told serious diseases, serious inflictions of some kind. But here it was very specific in that his household could not bear any children for that time. Which is interesting because chapter 20 seems to happen in a very short amount of time. So I don't know how they would have even been able to know that or not. But that was something that God was doing. And so God allowed them to bear children again. It's just kind of another somewhat interesting difference. But both households here in chapter 20 and chapter 12 were inflicted with some harm until the matter was resolved. So definitely an interesting kind of compare and contrast there. We're about out of time. That's all I have for chapter 20. Any other comments or anything on this before we move on? I don't believe Abraham is going to have this problem again in his lifetime, if I remember correctly. But, again, chapter 26, Isaac pulls the same stunt. So he got this idea from somewhere. So we're gonna stop there. We're going to move into chapter 21 next week. We're going to have the birth of Isaac. We're probably going to spend quite a bit of time on 21. We might spend 2 or 3 weeks on 21 because there's a lot to go through. There's a lot of different moving parts going on in 21. It's a little bit longer, a little bit more to talk about. So we'll continue on there next week. So if you want to read ahead, go ahead and read chapter 21. I don't think we'll get too far into it next week, but we'll definitely start it. Thank you.